Good afternoon and welcome to the UN Global Compact Nigeria Network session. This session is part of the Virtual Leaders Summit agenda to kickstart a global conversation about how to respond to and recover from the humanitarian and economic shock of the Covid-19 crisis in order to set a new course for a socially just, low carbon and climate resilient world. Today we'll be focusing on the implication of Covid-19 on achieving the SDGs in Nigeria. We are now facing a global pandemic with unprecedented social and economic impacts. While we must scale up the immediate health response to curb the spread of Covid-19, the response to the pandemic ought to be structured towards a better and more resilient recovery. Businesses are more vulnerable than ever, and it will no longer be possible to conduct business as usual across all industries after this pandemic. Mass production shutdowns and economic and supply chain disruptions have caused a ripple effect across all economic sectors in Nigeria and Africa as a continent. Millions of workers around the globe are learning to work, school, and even shop from home. They are also trying to figure out how to stay productive and connected as they do it. Paid sick leave in countries which never mandated it before has become a front-burner issue. More employers than ever are talking about mental wellness and emotional well-being. The lockdown order has also affected people in the informal sector who practically live on a daily income. This has led to increased hunger and poverty in the country. All these have shed light on the need to scale up the SDGs. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by a panel of business leaders and change makers, each representing a different industry in Nigeria, to share their insights. Today, we have Mr. Abubakar Suleiman. He is the Chief Executive Officer for Sterling Bank, one of Nigeria's most vibrant financial institutions. Welcome, Abubakar. We also have Ndidi Nwuneli. Ndidi is the founder of Leap Africa. Leap Africa is a youth-focused leadership and development non-profit organization with a mission to inspire, develop, and empower youth. You're welcome, Ndidi.
Thank you so much.
We also have Tayo Aduloju. He is the Chief Operating Officer of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, the NESG. NESG is the foremost private sector and think tank advocacy group in Nigeria. You're welcome, Tayo.
Thank you for having me.
Finally, we have Tinuade Awe. Tini is the Executive Director for Regulations at the Nigerian Stock Exchange. The Nigerian Stock Exchange is a sustainable exchange championing Africa's growth based in Nigeria. You're welcome, Tinu.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
I welcome you all to this session and thank you very much for your kind opening comments. I would like to open our discussion today by asking each of our speakers to briefly reflect for a couple of minutes each on the crisis and the implications that it currently has on some key SDG-related issues in Nigeria. Let's start with you, Abubakar. Before the pandemic, Nigeria have had issues around poverty for a very long time. And the situation has worsened with the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic as more Nigerians are falling within the poverty zone. Can you give us an analysis of how COVID-19 has affected households, coupled with the reduction in oil prices?
Thank you very much. You're right about the current state of, or well, I would say the previous state of events in Nigeria prior to the current crisis. I think we all knew that we were barely coping, as it were. Poverty levels had been going up for a while. And to that extent, I think this is a double whammy for us. To reflect on how specifically the current event will affect or has affected household, obviously the most obvious one is the direct impact on employment, especially people who are day workers and whose employment came to an end the day we went into lockdown. Obviously, that is pretty straightforward. But beyond those day workers, the other way that the crisis has translated into a negative impact on household has to do with impact on government. Like you know, there's so much dependency on government, and a lot of our businesses are actually appendages to government. So the moment government revenue is impacted and government starts to reflect on its spending, there are immediate impacts on households. And in some cases where there are social investments that are ongoing, the risk that this investment might be reduced or suspended is a real one for many households. We also see the likelihood of an indirect impact on household with the exchange rate. So what we've seen is that there is a crash in the oil market, not for the first time, and the immediate impact of that is that reserves are under pressure. There are possibility of the exchange rate essentially becoming more volatile if we don't moderate our import levels. And so that could translate into imported inflation. Again, with people on fixed wages, that is something to look out for. We also see the removal of subsidies where they exist. And so you'd expect that while income levels are not likely to move up anytime soon, we could see costs going up. For instance, the petrol subsidy is one that comes to mind if oil price start to trend upward again. We could also see weaker domestic demand and the impact of that on revenues across border and on wages. So clearly, what households are likely to do now is to cut back on spending and to preserve their savings against a rainy day. In addition to that, we will expect to see falling diaspora remittances if unemployment persists in Western capitals. And this will affect not just the urban poor, but most equally the rural poor, those that benefit the most from these remittances from families abroad. So what we see here are a broad range of ways in which the pandemic and the economic downturn will negatively affect households. And in many cases, these are households that are already, in a sense, on the verge, and therefore they don't have a lot of room to navigate. So our concern is that if we see private sector spending going down, and at the same time government spending is going down, and in a sense access to debt to bridge the gap is limited, I think the real concern is that we could see ourselves in a recession. And in a recession, one way to come out would be to increase government spending and to hopefully drive production. But unfortunately, with the level of debt that the government has currently, that might not be as easy as it would otherwise be.
Thank you, Abubakar. Ndidi, moving over to you. In Nigeria, food security remains a pressing issue. Hunger is intrinsically linked to priority SDGs in Nigeria, such as goals around health and well-being, and the SDG on education. What are practical steps that business can do to support food security in the country? And how can these actions be integrated in ways in which companies can drive business goals while also contributing to food security targets in the country?
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me on this panel. Clearly, we're facing a looming food crisis. ECOWAS estimates that the number of food insecure people in West Africa will double by August if we don't take urgent action. So what's required from the private sector? The first is that we have to recognize food and agriculture as essential, and we have to support these two sectors. All across the value chains, we have to ensure that our farmers can engage in the planting season. We're embarking on the planting season as we speak, and we need seeds and fertilizer to get to these farmers right away. Access between farmers and market. Now, in many of our cities, because of social distancing and other policies, we've reduced market days to 3 days out of 5, and we're seeing rising food prices. So there are 4 things private sector must do. First, private sector must collaborate. We must follow what we've seen, where CEOs decided to forget about profits in the immediate term and focus on ensuring that people can eat. We have seen retailers collaborating, we've seen manufacturers collaborating. We need to see a lot more information sharing and collaboration. Also, we need to think about this issue around hoarding and price hikes that are unreasonable at this time. Prioritize the health and well-being of Nigerians. Secondly, we need to backward integrate. I would advocate that we need to institute a policy where we at least 60% of our inputs from Nigeria. This especially applies to processors who import to start looking locally to substitute some of their imported products. We've seen leaders like Nestle and Nigerian breweries invest in local sourcing.
I think we lost Ndidi.
Yeah, we have.
Okay, while we wait for Ndidi, I think we should just move over to Tayo. Tayo, Nigeria just recently submitted the second voluntary national review. How far have we as a country gone in achieving the SDGs in relation to the first VNR we submitted?
I think the first thing to stress is that the first voluntary national review submitted in June 2017 was more of an institutional signaling of where Nigeria wanted to go. And that report reflected more of the baseline at the time. If you remember, mainstreaming of the SDGs in Nigeria was relatively slow 2015 out. And so what happened with the 2017 review was we set more of baselines and clear targets and pointed to strategies that were going to go into the economic recovery and growth plan as a way to focus on where we needed to go. So between 2017 and 2020, several things have happened. One, if you remember that when we were submitting the June 2017 review, we were in the middle of an economic recession. And we had growing poverty rates. We had a high inflationary environment with significant contraction triggered by, again, at that time, an oil-led dynamic. If you remember the 2015 drop in oil prices. Unfortunately, in 2020, we're back to another oil-led shock, driven this time, as Abubakar pointed out, by COVID-19. So of course, if you look at the national review for 2020, you see that the big issues remain poverty, SDG 1, inclusive economy, SDG 8, health and well-being, SDG 3, education, SDG 4, sustainable peace and security, SDG 16, and partnerships, SDG 17. So if we take that apart, I think the transmission effects of COVID-19 already can be seen in terms of poverty. At the point, at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, we were already edging towards 100 million people in extreme poverty. And just like the virus thrives on underlining health issues, the transmission effects of COVID-19 also thrives on underlining economic issues. In our case, for example, the COVID-19, we think will likely add about 30 million to the unemployed numbers. And so that's something that the national review has pointed to. In terms of health, there was one indicator that we shifted on. We moved mortality rates from 157 to 132. However, we guess that sustaining those levels, that current rate may be hampered by COVID-19. Of course, with SDGs, out-of-school children in Nigeria remains a big issue, with a huge literacy polarity between the North and the South. If you look, for example, at Southwest Nigeria, we have 78% of children that can speak and write, compared to 17% in the Northeast. This points to a huge literacy polarity in Nigeria that needs to be addressed. Same with the out-of-school children numbers. When you look at the question of inclusive economy and inclusive growth, That remains a problem in Nigeria because of our significantly large informal sector. 53% of all of the labor force in Nigeria is works in the informal market economy, and that poses a challenge in meeting our goals of inclusive growth and of sustainable jobs. So when you look at this year's review, it is accentuated by pre-existing socioeconomic conditions. Indeed, it was pointing to hunger. The hunger rate in Nigeria has risen with the COVID-19, and except we address shocks and broken value chains that have been triggered by the lockdown and restriction of movement, we're likely to see increasingly food insecure and vulnerable populations across the country. The World Food Programme heat map shows a rapid increase in hunger rate in Nigeria currently, because daily earners and weekly earners have not only lost their income in the lockdown and restriction, but they've also eroded their working capital, which means to restart this daily earners and weekly earners, remember I said 53% in this informal sector, you need to be able to create an economic stimulus to restart those type of businesses and enterprises. So this creates a huge problem, and if sufficient interventions, one, in livelihoods, two, in lifelines, do not come on time, we may actually have a long-run effect of COVID-19 way beyond 2021, 2022, 2023. Of course, there's a generation of children missing school, as it is around the world, and only children that seem to have digital access can have education access at this time. This also aggravates the challenges we face. Of course, the cascading consequences of the social dislocation that is caused by COVID-19 then translates into other types of social symptoms. We're seeing crime rate in many urban centers rise radically, and with a huge tendency for destitution. So I think in terms of where the voluntary national review is on the sustainable development goals, they've been significantly impacted by the COVID-19. And so going forward, some of the things to think about is a stronger alignment between the SDGs and the institutions. I need to drive them. The integrated funding plan to support the SDGs has to be something we think about, particularly because we are showing very weak outcomes in the SDGs 1, 8, 3, 4, 5, and these tend to be the ones particularly that drive the social dislocation. Last thing is to discuss some accountability around data. As we begin to address the key issues like hunger and poverty rates across the country, it's important to have a national data set that is thorough and allows us to reach people. So for example, what we are doing in Nigeria now is accelerating the social, what we're calling the rapid response register of vulnerable persons across the board. And that should help us address the broad set of issues that we're dealing with.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tayo. Sorry to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt you. I will come back to you on that. Let's move over to Tinu. But for those of you in the audience who do not understand or who don't know what VNR means, the Voluntary National Review is a process through which countries access and present progress made in achieving the global goals and the pledge to leave no one behind. And Dr. Tayo has given us a detailed analysis of where we are at from the first VNR we submitted. So moving over to Tinu, I'll say we are aware that the Nigerian Stock Exchange has floated the Green Bond. And the Green Bond is meant to support environmental friendly technologies, which is interestingly in line with Principles 8 of the UN Global Compact. Nigeria is also a signatory to COP25. So we want to ask, to what extent has the work you've done around the Green Bond helped to achieve the SDGs, especially in relation to Goal 13, climate change?
Thank you very much for that question, Naomi. So we actually didn't float a green bond ourselves, but there are 4 green bonds that are listed on the exchange. 2 of them are sovereign green bonds, as in they're bonds by the federal government of Nigeria, and one is a green bond by a power company, North South Power Company, and the other one is a green bond by bank, Access Bank PLC. So we believe that the market which we engendered for the purposes of green finance, green bonds in this case, has done a lot to move. Remember that before the green bonds were floated, bond, the first one in 2017, this was a market that was $0. And as of today, we now have 4 bonds that are $136 million in the contribution, the capitalization of the market. And so we think that that's gone a far way. Now, if you look at the Nigeria's nationally determined contribution targets, they have 20% unconditional for reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And then we're also aiming at mitigation in the areas of climate change mitigation, energy, reduction of energy, oil and gas, and agric. To do mitigation of green gas emissions in those areas, and adaptation in agric, education, forestry, and a number of other places. Now, if you connect it to the things that these green bonds were issued for, so for example, the first sovereign one being issued for renewable energy, the Access Bank one being issued for financing and refinancing of facilities for water flood defense, solar generating facilities, and agriculture, you can see that they fit right into the targets that Nigeria itself had set with respect to the climate agreement, the Paris Agreement. And so we think that we've done quite a bit. Now, I think maybe it would be helpful for me to say what it is exactly that we did in order to get these bonds listed. So first of all, we had to help to create a market. And in order to do that, we started our sustainability journey from 2013 when we joined the Sustainable Stock Exchange Group Initiative. We're the third African stock exchange to do that in 2013. And in 2016, we put together a proposal for a green bond, a sovereign green bond, and sent it to the Minister of Environment, who is Under Secretary General for the UN, Mrs. Amina Mohammed, and worked with her, very closely with her and a group of other entities and stakeholders in that space. And I think it goes to the point that I think Andrew was making about collaboration, that if you want to move in this area, advancing the SDGs and actually being able to achieve, you have to have collaboration. So that market was created. The sovereign went in, the sovereign did 2 bonds, and I think that encouraged the corporates to do bonds. Every entity that had to be a party to that creation of that market worked with the creation of that market, whether it was the Ministry of the Environment, the DMO, the Securities and Exchange Commission, working day and night from the highest levels and the exchange to ensure that this market was created. And even just last week on World Environment Day on the 5th of June, we had we have this sustainable market capital market series, and the first one was green bonds, development of green bond markets in West Africa, where we basically wanted to do a how to and bring people who are involved in this space to deal with the issues. We also have a collaboration with the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, which, as you may know, is the first stock exchange where the first green bond was listed in 2007. And Access Bank, for example, that issued the 15 billion naira green bond that is for financing and refinancing things like water flood defense and the other things that I had spoken about, has dual listed on that exchange. So for us, it's something that we're very proud of. It's something that we think is the way to go. You need to be able to finance. We can't only talk about greening the environment. We can't only talk about reducing the emissions and reducing the carbon footprint. if you don't have the finance to do it. And green bonds are a tried and tested way of doing that. And we feel that it's only going to grow, and we're ready and have been partnering with various people to ensure that we grow the market and put it out there as a viable way of dealing with these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you so much. Didi, maybe you could just do a summary of your points before we move over to this next section.
Apologies, I think you lost me. I'm not sure what you heard when I was speaking, but I basically was trying to say that we act sector to collaborate and take on a leadership role to ensure that critical time, but also achieve SDG 2.
Internet.
She's again.
Okay, moving forward, the COVID-19 pandemic have also left an indelible mark on the future of the workplace, where it will be no longer possible to do business as usual. And although the pandemic has affected us all badly, the shape of the new reality in Nigeria is not all bad news, as it also presents an opportunity for partnerships. To spur greater access and innovation. This global pandemic has the power to ignite a business paradigm shift and create new opportunities for companies across Africa. It becomes interesting to see how both governments, companies, non-governmental organizations, and even civil societies are preparing to work together to accelerate transformational change through the SDGs and curb the bad effect of the pandemic. Starting with you, Dr. Tayo, COVID-19 has exposed the challenges we have around the health sector. Beyond government intervention, there have also been private sector intervention. Can you really tell us the extent to which partnerships among all stakeholders have worked?
I think what COVID-19 did was to accentuate the need for deploying the collective capacity of society to respond to sustainable development. And so what we've seen in Nigeria with the COVID-19 response is a broad-based whole society response approach, which is the very spirit of the SDGs. If you remember in 2015, one of the differences in how Nigeria approached the SDGs from the MDGs was this broader, more whole society approach with the establishment of a private sector advisory group, a civil society advisory group that plugged to the national networks in the private sector and civil society, so that this whole society approach kind of happens on a consistent basis. And that's what we saw with COVID-19. The private sector through COVID has mobilized to date approximately 40 billion naira. That has been deployed in conjunction with federal and state governments, aligning needs and requirements tied to projections within the COVID-19 response plan. That has taken a lot of collaboration and talking to each other to agree on what the priorities are. And so that went along with the support, both the resourcing side in terms of resource mobilization, on the private sector, government and development sector, but it also created collaboration on the actual response and deployment of resources. And currently there is a core tracking mechanism for COVID-19 in Nigeria led by the Presidential Task Force that allows an alignment in terms of resources, where they are needed across the country, how they are deployed, and how they are organized on ground at each isolation center, testing center, etc., to guarantee that resources are going to where they are needed the most. Of course, the health sector in Nigeria has suffered from low investment historically. So with ramping up for the response, some parachuting approach was required to get the capabilities. For example, we started out with 2 molecular labs ready to go at the beginning of the response, and we are way around 24 molecular labs across the country today. And so you can see the scaling up happened rather quickly. A big part of making that happen was us working together across board. Also, many other community level and state level actors have also contributed massively. We are seeing community level coordination with local governments. We're seeing state level coordination between private sector and civil society across the country with government. And so what I would say is that COVID-19 actually accentuated the need to do this together. That's on the health response side. Now, similarly on the non-health response side, we are seeing a massive collaboration. I guess Ndidi will talk about it when she intervenes on hunger response. We're seeing a broad private sector coalition partner with government on the hunger response side also. But I think altogether, what we have seen with COVID-19 is that the crisis escalated. It created the very imperatives for these sustainable and strategic partnerships that the SDGs have advocated for, and it also has created the lines of work streams that typically will be silos between agencies and businesses working very differently to get stuff done. At the NESG, for example, we've worked with the Presidential Task Force since the beginning of the response on mobilizing and creating corridors for food, corridors for businesses and essential services, power, telecommunications to work seamlessly during the lockdown. And as the government is making its decisions, private sector is actively engaging in the room to ensure that we're working together, both in the response, both in the resource mobilization, and as we think about how to reopen the economy, how to do that also. So I think the spirit of the response has been whole society. Of course, there are huge deficits because of the scale of the crisis and the scale of the response. You're dealing with a country that needs to respond to 100 million people in extreme poverty, and that's aggravated by the economic lockdown. So you can tell that the size of the coverage of both health and non-health responses have been huge. But altogether, I'll say a very well done to the national stakeholders and actors, because without us coming together, holding the fort against COVID-19 would have been almost impossible.
Thank you, Dr. Tarios. Still with you, I would like to ask, given the fact that the organization, the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, is the foremost private sector-led think tank and policy advocacy group in Nigeria, what are you doing to ensure that Nigeria, as this nation working with private sector, are mainstreaming the whole SDGs into the National Development Plan?
So, Nigeria.
I think we lost Dr. Tayo, so let's move over to Ndidi. The SDGs is an agenda for our future, and the inclusion of young people is paramount in ensuring they are active participants in building stronger, more resilient societies. In a country like Nigeria, where the average age is 18, mobilizing youth and people to contribute to the SDGs is even more paramount. However, many young people lack the needed support and formal structures to tap into their full potential. This includes lack of access to financing, lack of education, and lack of platforms that allow for youth participation in policies. What is the organization Leap Africa, young people with the roles to be meaningful change agents in the country? So let's go back to Dr. Taya. I think Dr. Taya is back on.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm not sure what you heard last.
You actually just started.
Okay, but what I was saying is, with regards to thinking through the SDGs, Nigeria is just at the beginning of developing its successor plans to the Vision 2020, which of course ends this year, and its economic recovery and growth plan, which also terminates in 2020. So for Nigeria, it's an opportunity to set a robust strategy and action plan for a decade of action, 2020 to 2030. And so what we have done is to ensure that the SDGs form the core terms of reference for all the different thematic groups that are looking at the future development plan for Nigeria. As you know, the president has set an ambitious target for SDG 1 to lift 100 million Nigerians out of poverty by 2030. And to align with that, there are a couple of other ambitious targets for 2030. So those targets are going into the new planning process. And the planning process, again, has been mobilized to include public sector, private sector, civil society, to ensure that there's a whole society approach in thinking through how to get it done. I think one of the points that Ndidi made, and I think all you, Tinu and Abubakar have pointed to, is that to fund the SDGs, you need to go way beyond what government can afford to spend. That requires that the whole society approach brings different types of funding and resources, be aligned in such a way and in such a sequence that allows us to target the SDGs from different points of view. So we have, at the NESG, mobilized the private sector to be a major part of this development planning process, so that this new development plan in this era of the decade of action will reflect in both in the spirit and the content of the development plan, that collaboration and that accountability and responsibility of the broad set of actors to getting the SDGs achieved. Some of the key things that we have already rallied around in terms of priorities is to ensure that the SDGs are viewed as the lens through which we prioritize for the future. Nigeria at the end of this year should have about, is projected to have about 211 million Nigerians, and that number will grow to 410 million by 2050 and 270 million by 2030. So the growing population creates pressure on social amenities, infrastructure, food security, jobs, etc. 76% of that population in 2050 will be young Nigerians under the age of 35. This accentuates the need for a more sustainable approach to both economic growth and development agenda. And so those elements, including their targets and their priorities, have formed a major part, like I said, of both the terms of reference and the strategic objectives that are going into the core groups that are thinking through the different aspects of the Nigerian economy and the Nigerian state. Our hope and ambition is that this will allow for the SDGs to be better mainstreamed. Also, the Office of the SDGs has created this critical alignment that we didn't have before through the integrated sustainable development goals model that allows for better assessment of policies and how those policies deliver the SDGs. Then, of course, the national planning process is better aligned with a national statistics system that is more integrated into the SDGs to ensure that in this decade of action, not only can we track and hold all stakeholders accountable, but that we can course correct quickly year on year to ensure that this time we leave no one behind.
Thank you so much, Tayo, for that detailed analysis. Moving over to Tinu. Because of the impact of climate change, we have seen migration of not only humans, but animals like cattle from the northeast to other parts of Nigeria. We have also seen how flooding and deforestation have affected various cities in Nigeria. What can we do to stem this tide?
Okay, so it has to be an all hands on board approach. And there are a number of things that I think that we can do. I think whenever you have this kind of environmental issue, you either find a way to adapt or you find a way to mitigate, or you do both, mitigation and adaptation. And I think what we need to do in Nigeria is both things. But before I even go into mitigation and adaptation, I think you need to communicate. I feel based on, and it's not based on any research that I've done, so I am not an expert in this area, but I certainly think that we have to do a lot much more communicating so that people can take personal responsibility for the environment. And it's not just communicating so that they will take personal responsibility. We have to let them know the benefit. So if you see, for example, when you have floods, especially in countries where you can take out flood insurance, you'll find that the year after the flood, everybody understands that you need to take flood insurance. But maybe 5-6 years later, it's not that same thing. But because they've had that personal encounter, and so there's a personal interest in ensuring that they do something to protect themselves. It's the same sort of thing. There has to be targeted communication to the man on the street about the environment, and it has to be communication that is fit for purpose. There's no need talking about green gas emissions, burning fossil fuels, black carbon, and some of the environmental lingo, which the average man on the street does not understand, and therefore cannot get into that collaborative state that Tayo is talking about to join all hands on board to deal with this issue. Because a lot of the things that are environmental require the man on the street to take action as well. So on the individual level, I think there needs to be communication, there needs to be a lot of education, and a lot of risk-benefit analysis engagement with the average person. Now, we also need to have responsible businesses. So how do we get businesses to be responsible? In some areas, you do, and I'll borrow from the field of corporate governance, you do a corporate governance rating, and the company immediately sees that there's a link between corporate governance and its ability to get funding, or a link between corporate governance and its status and its ability to attract ESG funds. We also need to make a link between companies that are doing right by way of issues that affect the environment and companies that are not. It's a continuum, and so I don't think it's something where it's a stick, but you have to have sufficient carrots. So I think it was Abubakar that was talking about how the government is a significant part of our economy. It means that there are a lot of entities that contract with government. If you want to get into a contract with government, can we have a situation where what you do with carbon credits in other countries, you do a carbon credit, you do something that is localized for us, and it's only if you have below a particular amount of carbon credits that you can get certain types of contracts from government, or that you can get certain types of tax reliefs. When businesses then see the connection between doing business ethically, doing business in an environmentally friendly manner, and their bottom line. Now, just very quickly onto climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation. You've got to adapt. It has already happened. So, for example, the deforestation that we've seen in many parts of the country, and the fact that there's migration that is occurring there because you've removed the carbon sink in those places. You have migration both of humans as well as animals. You have different vectors moving from where they would normally be to another part of the country. People are saying, no, we never used to have X here. It's all interconnected. So each state, I think, has to be encouraged, empowered, and the federal government itself to have an environmental policy and to implement that environmental policy. If tree planting can even start from using, children, encouraging them in every school to plant a tree, encouraging businesses to plant trees in cities, having green areas. These are not high-hanging fruits, but they can help to mitigate and help to, help us to adapt to the issues. Also, how do you build your roads? If there's already been flooding, then you need to ensure that you're building above the level of the flood. Not that every year, and we see it every year, certain roads get wiped out. And you're wondering, don't these people understand that there has been some environmental impact, whether it's erosion, whether it's deforestation, that has caused the sea level to, move up. Therefore, you need to adapt by building a different type of road. So these are all things, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. A lot of these things are being done in other places. Where there is a will and you have the entire community, whether it's the financial institutions, the government, educators, everybody realizing that we need to move forward and seeing the benefit of doing it, it can be done. I know that we have limited time, so I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tinade. And thank you for our audience for staying with us this far. Remember to drop your comment, your questions at the chats there. Our panelists will be answering your questions in a few minutes. Now, moving on to Abubakar. Given your role as the MD and CEO of a financial institution, how do you think access to finance will aid the attainment of the goals? Most specifically, how can access to finance alleviate poverty, hunger, and inequality?
Thank you very much. Let me start by revisiting the concept of access to finance. Usually when we hear that, we start thinking of access to finance for households or for those who are financially excluded. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the way you gain real impact from access to finance is to ensure that you have the finance you need to create the economic environment or the infrastructure for economic growth. And more often than not, we don't have that. What do I mean by that? Most African countries, Nigeria included, pay a phenomenal amount of money to access funding. And this is not consistent with the true risk profile of the country. So if we're paying 9%, for instance, to access funding for 5 years, whereas a commensurate or a similar country somewhere in Europe is paying 3% to access funding, and they can access funding for 3 times the duration, maybe for 15 years. That is a significant difference in how finance can play a role in creating the economic environment or the opportunity required. And there is no point pushing access to finance to people who are not economically included. And I'm not just talking about people who are unemployed. I'm talking about people who are on the verge of the society and therefore do not earn enough to essentially use finance meaningfully. So if we want to talk access to finance, I'm interested in discussing how countries like ourselves, under the right governance, similar to the kind of governance that exists in the Sukuk bond that the federal government has issued today, how we can access finance at a much lower cost for a much longer duration so that we can build the social and economic infrastructure that are missing. Because if you don't have those infrastructure, then you can't create the employment that is required. And if people are not economically included, there's no point pushing the nice to have financial inclusion for a lot of them. What is most important is that they can earn a good living. So I would say that financing has far more impact if it is applied to unlock value so that the small businesses and the household can then earn a decent living. That said, I do have another challenge or problem with how we've defined access to finance, where increasingly we think that once people are on a payment platform, they're deemed to have access to finance. We seem to forget that being able to make payments is a spending activity, and more often than not does not alter your economic status. So it is important that when we discuss finance, we are talking about the financial products that actually enable people earn more, improve their quality of life, or pull people out of poverty. A lot of what we define today doesn't do that. And we have to be very deliberate about this, the things that we measure clearly are the things that the resources are being applied to. So I give you an instance on how access to finance can make a difference, or financial inclusion can make a difference. We went out with an educational finance product that is targeted at the bottom of the pyramid. So we're looking at people who have children in private school, but they are at the low, at the bottom of the pyramid. So they actually can afford to, but because there are no access to decent government schools, they have to put their kids in private school. And of course, a lot of them are daily wage earners, so they don't have the capacity to pay school fees at the beginning of the term. We intervened, brought in a micro lending product, and were able to lend to the families, but the facility or the loan goes straight into paying school fees. What that did was it unlocked value within the school ecosystem. They started paying their teachers on time. They improved the environment. They spent more money on teaching aids and materials. And we found out that we're able to collect a lot of this money from the families that we've lent money to, because we have agents that are able to collect the money weekly. And surprisingly, the best return, or the best portfolio that we saw, was in the Northeast, not even in Lagos, where we expected the portfolio to do well. So my point is that access to finance has to be directed at improving people's economic well-being. And I fear that a lot of the work we do in access to finance today doesn't go that far. We are not trying to improve access to healthcare through micro health insurance. We're not really putting enough effort into micro credits that might enable the farmer in the village, for instance, to improve their productivity by investing in higher quality input. And in many cases, the market, access to market, which is required for you to take advantage of any improvement in yield and productivity, is not there. So if you're not able to get your product to market, no matter how much financing I put at the rural production level, then you don't get the value, because you produce more, but your prices go down. So I think we need to be very strategic if access to finance is going to help us reduce poverty and hunger. The way we've gone at it now is we're checking a lot of boxes, but clearly the poverty level is not going down. And it's because we've, first of all, not unlocked access to finance at the level of the state, the level of the federal government, such that they can actually deliver infrastructure. And secondly, when we give access to finance to the household and to the small businesses, we're not giving them the kind of financial product that will enable them be more productive, that will enable them earn more, and therefore grow not just their businesses, but their local environment. So yes, financing is required. Yes, we must do something about it, but let's not be misled into thinking that onboarding another 10 or 20 million individuals onto our payment platform would unlock any meaningful economic value unless we do the big work.
Thank you, Abubakar. Thank you so much. We are now running out of time, so we'll have to take the remaining questions and take it very fast. So we have spoken about the challenges brought by COVID-19 and how it has affected the need, it has reflected the need to scale up attainment of key SDGs. We have also discussed the power of the pandemic to drive a business paradigm shift to achieve the SDGs. I would like us now to look into the future and discuss COVID-19 and how business can recover responsibly, get involved in achieving the SDGs, and quicken the path towards realizing the 2030 agenda. So can each of our speakers reflect and share with us how the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact and the SDGs can shape their company's response to this crisis? Starting with Ndidi.
Thank you. I'm going to turn off my video so that you can hear me. Just nod if you can hear me. Okay, fantastic. Apologies again for all the challenges with technology. So from my perspective, I wear many hats as an SME in the food and agriculture landscape, and I work with about 400 SMEs as well. And then through Leap Africa, I would say there are a couple of things we have to do. Number one, we have to take personal responsibility for our staff, our suppliers, our distributors. As individuals, we can lead by educating, empowering, and informing. I think what COVID-19 has done is enabled us to reimagine and rebuild. Our food ecosystem was already fragile. COVID-19 has shaken it even more. And there's an urgent need for innovation and the use of technology. In the food ecosystem, we need to be innovative about the food that we create, sourcing locally and investing in homegrown solutions. We need food that's affordable as well and accessible and available all year round so we can address SDG 2. And that requires that we partner with our research institutions, academic institutions, and that private sector collaborate to innovate. The second thing is that we need to share data. And Dr. Tayo talked about rebuilding better. We need to think about how we creatively share data so that we can ensure policy making that's data-driven. And as private sector, we have to. We can't be on the sidelines because Nigeria needs us to ensure that we create the enabling environment for companies to thrive. And then finally, we really need to invest in our youth. And this is from the perspective of Leap Africa. We need to rebuild our educational system. COVID-19 has shown that our educational system is not ready for the 21st century. There's a huge digital divide, and most of us are cut off from the ability to take advantage of this. We need to retool our teachers, and we need to private-public partnerships that really invest in education. SDGs must form a critical component of every curriculum from primary school all the way to university. And through organizations such as Leap Africa, we need to reward our young people who are making a positive influence and a difference in society. Through the Social Innovators Program, Leap has been doing that for the last 17 years. We need to show new role models for our young people, innovators who are leading by example. And I think we incorporate this curriculum and revisit our curriculum. I think we'll raise a new generation of young people who will really transform this.
Okay, thank you, Ndidi. Over to you, Tayo.
I think when you think about the application of the UNGC principles in a post-COVID era, it begins with leadership. I think across board we need to see more proactive, more engaged leadership that is focused on getting things done. Nigeria does not like policies. Nigeria does not like plans. Most of the leading businesses do not like great sustainability strategies. But what happens is when the rubber meets the road, we are not executing, and we're not executing together. So as we go into this decade of action, the big rallying point is one, a sense of urgency to move on the issues. Because here's the thing. Nigeria will not be resilient socially, economically, culturally, environmentally, if we do not execute on the imperatives of the SDGs. So I think the principles, the UNGC principles, which anchor the fundamentals of business leadership around the SDGs and the development agenda, need to be the doable objectives, need to be the plans that get done, need to be a change in sustainable corporate governance culture, needs to be a better sense of multi-stakeholder accountability around sectors that need to shift and change, for example. So for example, we're discussing child labor, and we need to see more proactive accountability across the value chains. We're discussing food security. We need to see more accountable corporate leadership across the value chain, not just for the bottom line, but for the social impact line. We need to see better and stronger, more proactive, more responsible, more accountable business leadership on issues of corruption, So on one hand, we need to discuss open government, but we need to discuss open private sector. And a big part of the issue in Nigeria when you discuss a sustainable economic environment is that we are leading in anti-corruption from both sides, that the demand and the supply side for corruption finds no place in Nigeria. And if we can do that, if we can think of the principles, the UNGC principles around anti-corruption, human rights, environment, and labor standards as leadership imperatives, I think we can get this done. But it requires, one, a sense of urgency, two, a bias for getting things done. Okay, when in doubt, let's execute, right? And third, let's execute together. Mobilizing the collective capacity of society to get things done. I think if we do that, the post-COVID era, which promises first to be very difficult for Nigeria. We're likely to be in recession into 2021. But if we do this, then we stand the chance of mobilizing in such a way as to transcend the crisis with a more resilient Nigeria socially, economically, culturally, politically, and environmentally. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tayo. Thank you. Over to you, Tinwadi. We're running out of time, so please be brief.
I didn't mute myself. So I'll talk from the point of view that the fact that I work with a market. And so from the point of view of a market, what you want to make sure is that the marketplace is one that is concerned about the SDGs. And how do you do that? You engender policies, you engender rules, you engender standards that will help people to, be able to assess what they're doing along the lines of compliance with the SDGs. So we have sustainable disclosure standards that we created after we had signed on to the UN Global Compact. And I think if you look at those standards, you follow them, you do things along those lines that will allow you to do those disclosures, you will find that a lot of the things that we're saying that have to be done under the SDGs, that have to be done under the UNGC, will get done. So that's number one. I think you also have to look at it from a community perspective. And I think both Ndidi and Tayo have spoken about the importance of collaboration. Collaboration, absolutely important. Things in the community that businesses can do, they need to do, and they need to do them collaboratively. I think you also need to look at it from the point of view of the environment. There's so many smaller environmental organizations that businesses can partner with, whether you do it from the point of view of how much paper are we using in our office to the point of view of how much plastic are we using. We don't want to use plastic again. And I think COVID-19 presents a unique opportunity to reduce the carbon footprint on a paper level, at least. Presents an opportunity to reduce it on a plastic level because you're at home. So you can use glass. You're not using, businesses need to come out with things like that and encourage people to do that kind of thing. You also look at it from point of view of your employees. How are you treating them? And within COVID-19, again, you have an excellent opportunity. People are challenged. They're challenged not only with the work they're doing for you, they're challenged emotionally and they're challenged with their families. Businesses have to come out and ensure that these are things that they care about as well, and they treat their employees right. And I think the opportunities are there.
Thank you, Tino. Finally, Abubakar.
I will try to keep this short. So I'll speak from a practical experience. What we've done, and I think is something I will encourage companies to think about, is to build our strategy in a manner that it is interwoven and anchored into the SDGs. So when we started about 5 years ago to refresh our strategy, we said to ourselves, we wanted to focus on things that are important to the government, that are important to non-governmental organizations, and that can be done profitably. And we ended up with what we've described as the heart of Sterling, which is to focus on the health sector, education, agriculture, renewable energy, and transport. And when we sort of took this and we kind of, placed it side by side with the SDG goals, we realized that we've got ourselves partners in anyone who is interested in driving this. And so why am I saying this? If we want to see things get done like Tayo is advocating, let us make it profitably to do those things. The things that get done in Nigeria or anywhere else for that matter are the things that deliver profit. They may not be the most profitable, but by virtue of being able to deliver a return, they become sustainable. You also find that it's easy to sort of galvanize resources around that sort of opportunity. So my advice to government is that we must increasingly hide profit under the SDGs, because the search for profit will ensure that people will be lifted in the process. But I also don't think that these are things that require subsidies. All they require are lighter regulations, better regulations. All they require are access to, again, sometimes just access to the regulator so we can have a conversation. But I'm glad that 5 years ago, we started the journey of driving the sectors that we've chosen. What we have seen after the COVID, well, I can't say it's post-COVID yet, but as a result of the COVID, is that a significant number of people are now with us. We have seen government and governmental institutions. We've seen resources coming at this. Our concern is that a lot of these people may not have a long-term commitment. So this is the time to lock people down to long-term commitment in fixing our healthcare. Let it not be that we just raise money today just to fix a few isolation centers. Some of the things that we have done is to look into long-term. So we have supported a lot of people who have put money in technology, telemedicine being one of them, where, for instance, we support a company called Tremendoc. And it became very useful when people could no longer go to the hospitals as a result of the risk of infection. Those are the kind of long-term opportunity we must take. We've also seen the same thing in trying to support people who are looking to upgrade hospitals across board or buy hospitals and create a more efficient system for delivering healthcare. We can't miss that opportunity. And finally, without, there's no way I won't talk about education as an opportunity arising from this. What needs to happen, what we really must do is to recognize that there are cheaper ways to deliver higher quality education to those who can least afford it. We have tested it with those who can afford it. Even if they go back to the classroom, some of those learnings, we must take it to the rural area. We must take it to the poorer schools and make sure that we raise the standard of education in those places. And finally, I guess that must be the second time I'm saying finally, but this time around I mean it. Renewable energy, renewable energy, renewable energy. We don't have the resources to invest on the skill that we need to solve the power problem on the grid system. We do have an opportunity to start to migrate ourselves to renewable energy, not just because it is increasingly becoming competitive, but because we can scale, we can take it one step at a time. And the use of renewable energy, people tend to forget, also encourages energy conservation. Once you're generating energy at that scale, you find yourself being more sensitive to how you use energy and therefore you use less of it. So really, let us take the business, take the goals that we are pursuing, take the government and sort of create a single unified force to end poverty in Nigeria.
Thank you very much, Abubakar. Finally, we have all discussed the impact of COVID-19 on achieving the SDGs. We have also reiterated the importance of the SDGs in recovering from this pandemic. Attaining this goal is not a one-person job, as all hands have to be on deck. To close this session, I'd like to ask each speaker to close this session by briefly sharing with us what you are going to do to ensure that you take actions to promote the SDGs in your individual organization. I'll start with Tina-De.
At the NSC, we've already been doing a lot with respect to the SDGs. As I said, we joined the Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative in 2013. We have the Sustainability Disclosure Guidelines, which means that the market has a rubric by which it can work on and disclose on and measure sustainability. We've worked to create a green bond market. We are continuing to work on other types of sustainable financing and social financing. We have a corporate governance rating system to ensure that companies are well governed and that they demonstrate good governance, which is important, again, with respect to achieving the SDGs, in that companies have realized that there are consequences of everything that they do. So we will continue to do what a market does, which is it reads the pulse. We've read the pulse. COVID provides a perfect opportunity to reset on the SDGs and to tie our shoelaces and get going again on all of what we've been doing. And I think indeed what we've done over the period of time since the lockdown, where we've had the trading system on without any hitches at all. Shows that, you know, we're resilient and that we're digitized and ready to move and, you know, move in an environmentally sustainable way. The fact that we have taken some of our programs, and Abubakar was actually on the first one, our digital closing gong, where we celebrate our companies, from the traditional to the digital, is also another example of showing sustainability and the fact that we can move in any environment in which we find ourselves. So we're resilient and we're ready. We're ready to go, and we're taking our stakeholders, the markets, with us, and going to where we need to go in order to get the SDGs achieved. I think Naomi is gone.
I think we lost our moderator.
Oh, Dr. Tayo.
Okay, there you are.
Thank you, Tinu. Over to you, Dr. Tayo.
Okay, so as a prelude to the year 2020, the NESG as a policy think tank has recalibrated all its 11 policy commissions and 44 policy thematic areas to prioritize the SDG targets within their policy objectives, both broadly and specifically in terms of SDG indicators. What this means is that you have the entire NESG think tank chasing specific indicators. So sometimes he notices that I'm chasing now over very specific agendas and indicators. We're doing it across board. So agriculture and food security, energy and renewable energy, gender, women, youth, education, health. And what this allows us to do is what I've been saying on this call all along. We can mobilize the collective capacity of society. We can get more actors on board and behind each agenda. We can deploy more aggressively across the country simultaneously at local, state, and federal levels. And we can do it across every value chain, no matter the sector. And so for us, this is big, and we think that's the way to get it done. And so we've mainstreamed the SDGs, like I said, as policy reform agendas, where the SDG targets become our targets, and our accountability is then to drive it day in, day out, year in, year out. The second thing we've done is to start an aggressive policy review process across board, so that at the policy and strategy level, beyond the development plans, where the action gets done within agencies, institutions of government, that they are aligned to these targets we have set for ourselves for this decade of action. And we think by doing so that the NESG is then propped and aligned to get us to translate these goals into tangible, measurable outcomes that Nigerians can perceive, feel, and experience.
Thank you, Tayo. Over to you, Ndidi.
So through the different hats I wear, zero hunger is the #1 priority that drives our work. ACE committed to nourishing Nigerians, working with 10,000 farmers. And through every aspect of our operation, we're committed to ensuring that we feed ourselves and feed the world. Sahel Consulting works across West Africa, doing exactly that, feeding people through partnerships, private sector-led growth, and even at the micro level, I've banned the use of plastic bottles in my office, and we use glasses, because charity begins at home. I also am very, very committed to what Abubakar talked about, doing well and doing good. And through every intervention that we're working on in yam, in cassava, in dairy, we're looking at innovative ways to preserve our environment, to ensure financial self-sustainability, to empower women. And this advancing local dairy development fits into directly what Tinuade was talking about, because we're putting nomadic communities into clusters and linking them up to private sector companies so that they can source milk in a sustainable way. And it compounds every aspect of the SDGs. And it's really, really an innovative initiative that Nigeria is leading. And then finally, Leap Africa is at the forefront of teaching SDGs. Every social innovator is working on an SDG. SDGs are part of the curriculum we teach in 6 African countries. And every year when we celebrate our social innovators, we focus on people, on climate, and on empowering homegrown solutions. So I am a champion for the SDGs, and I strongly believe that the only way that we can really take this forward in our country is by leading by example. You can have all the rhetoric you want, but unless people can see how you're living and how you're working, and it infuses into every aspect of your operation, you're not going to see a rapid change. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed. Finally, Abubakar.
Okay, thank you very much. I will keep it brief. In the next 30 days, we will be launching a product that allows us to deliver renewable energy as a service. What that means is that anybody who is credit-worthy can go onto our platform. It's called Alt Power, and be able to request to move their source of energy into solar power. And they can do this without making any investment in any asset. They simply will pay a monthly bill. We feel that this is the way to solve the problem for power without the significant environmental cost of people generating power in their homes today. And this will come out affordable and comparable to the current process of people generating powers in their homes using fossil fuel. That is something that will happen within the next 30 days. We are currently in the live test of a platform that allows our farmers to be able to sell their commodities directly into the market, and at the same time to be able to acquire input on the platform. This is a digital commodity exchange that will enable, hopefully improve the productivity of our farmers to the level where they can then begin to move away from extreme poverty. We've always believed that if we don't solve the issue of access to market, and if we don't resolve the issue of input into agriculture, the vast majority of our people that are currently employed in agriculture will never leave poverty. So this is our way of delivering a solution that is incredibly scalable, grant access to finance to millions of farmers, and also grant them access to market so that we cut out a lot of the middle and let them keep the bulk of the value that they create. We also believe that if we want to see improvement, especially in the urban areas, we need to continue to invest in mass transit. We invested over $50 million in mass transit in Lagos over the last couple of years. We're looking to take that experience and scale it and take it to other cities across Nigeria, specifically riding on the payment platform that we have deployed, which allows us to have instant contactless payment as people board the buses. We feel that once you've solved the issue of collection, you can then invest a lot more in mass transit. And we need to understand that the difference between having private cars on the road and having high quality mass transit is a massive environmental opportunity that we have not yet focused on. And finally, we're going to make specific investment in healthcare, starting with some health tech, basically to try and create the database that is required and to improve our ability to use health insurance as a way to improve access. So we've done some work with telemedicine. We think that this is something that could improve access to healthcare for the rural areas, but we also believe that the urban poor could benefit significantly from being able to use telemedicine as a way to access healthcare. Now, to bring it all together, we must then invest. We're supporting not just in the form of a debt or a loan, but also in the form of an equity to support the companies that are trying to get off the ground to provide affordable technology that the hospitals can use. So these are specific things that we're doing over the next couple of months. There are a couple of others, but I believe that this speaks to Tayo's point, which is action above all else.
Thank you very much, Abubakar. These are truly excellent reflections. We will now take questions, and due to the time, we'll just take one question from our audience. And the question we have here is directed to Tayo. It says, how can a non-profit attract funding towards improving healthcare and education development in Nigeria?
So the first thing is to get on ground and understand Nigeria. I think that funding is, I always say to people, funding is a result of a process that you go through. And so I think the first thing is not to discuss funding, but to discuss what aspect of health you want to tackle. And then when you're clear about what that is, to be able to then do the kind of analytics that allows you to map what kind of impacts and where the resources are. ODA into Nigeria grows year on year. That's the official development assistance from around the world. But the capacity of actors on ground to access those those assistance in terms of the ODA sector seems very low in terms of local players. So the Nigerian environment is still dominated heavily by players from outside accessing our own ODAs. Because the institutions here have not done the work to build the capacity to uptake. So the first thing I'll say is build the capacity to understand the local context, do your analytics to be able to put the kind of numbers on the table that makes a social investment and impact investment, a grant, more attractive to your institution or your particular product. And then think of blended finance. A lot of times when we think of an NGO, we think purely of government money or development sector money. Like I said earlier, that has to change. You need to think more broadly of corporate foundations, philanthropic organizations, for-profits that can be blended with grant, with credit. That type of blended finance thinking is the future of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think it's a brilliant question. What I will say is think more broadly than just grants, because most NGOs default is grant alone. Think of how do I create blended finance where there's a for-profit, which makes it sustainable. Back to Abubakar's point about profitability is the key attraction, to some impact type investing, to some type of grant support. Those type of models increasingly are more attractive even to official development assistance. If you look at all the money that came into Nigeria in 2019, from the top 4 big ODAs, you will see that a lot of that money required that the grant was attracting some type of private sector investment as a sustainability part of the grant program. And so increasingly, those become skills you need to have on ground in Nigeria. And in the health sector, it's even more important. So what I would say is get the context and the particular segment you would like to work in, define what the analytics are, think blended finance.
Thank you so much, Tayo. Time passes so quickly, and we are now at the end of this event for the Global Compact Nigeria Network session of our Virtual Leaders Summit. Our theme today has been the implications of COVID-19 on achieving the SDGs in Nigeria. Thank you to our speakers for sharing their insights on this session today. They were so invaluable. We will definitely continue the conversation offline as we are determined to continue engaging the private sector to drive ambition towards achieving the 2030 agenda, which is of the UN Global Compact. Thank you to the participants for your engagement on this session and throughout all of the Virtual Leaders Summits. We hope you have found them useful, engaging, inspiring, and also informational. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us. Well done, Naomi. Apologies again. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.